Hello, everyone, and welcome to LA Social Science. My name is Otis Noble III, and I am the Assistant Director of Engagement for the Division of Social Sciences. And today we have a treat for you. Today we have the first ever LA Social Science Summer Takeover, in which we will hear two amazing faculty members talk about abolition and feminism. Those two faculty members are Dr. Sarah Haley, who has appointments in African American Studies and in Gender Studies, and is now the newly appointed Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Women. And that other amazing professor that's a part of this conversation is Dr. Grace Hong. Dr. Grace Hong has appointments in Gender Studies and also Asian American Studies, and is the newly appointed Director for the Center for the Study of Women. Without further ado, Dr. Sarah Haley and Dr. Grace Hong, and don't forget to subscribe. Take care.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, Sarah. It's great to talk to you.
Yes, I'm really excited about this conversation.
I think we should just maybe begin by talking about abolition as a concept. And specifically, the importance of feminism,
Right.
and a feminist analysis to the framework of abolition. So, can you start off by talking a little bit about your kind of working definition of abolition and, why feminism is so central to it?
Sure, yeah. So, Ruthie Gilmore argues in Golden Gulag that prisons became a geographical and political solution, I'm paraphrasing her, right, to a host of problems and a host of crises. So prisons are the state's solution to crises in a moment in which the state is in itself in crisis. And so that leads me to think about abolition as a practice of reconceiving the answers to social problems and reconceiving what social relationships and institutions can look like. It's a project to expand our imaginaries about, again, both relationships and bigger societal structures in a way that does not require violence, that doesn't require interpersonal or state violence, in a way that doesn't enshrine structures and relations of hierarchy and dispossession, and in a way that relieves ourselves from a mass, historic, and globally significant reliance on captivity. It means thinking about what would have to change in our world if it was a world without a host of physical and surveillance structures of captivity, isolation, and estrangement. And so feminism, and specifically Black feminism, and as you have taught us so much about women of color feminism, comes in because it has already, helped us think about ways to reconceive social relationships. And it is also necessary to have an abolitionist relationship to gender and relationship to patriarchal control in order to reconceive society in ways that don't enshrine captivity and don't enshrine physical control.
Oh my God, that's so good, Sarah. That is so good. Oh, that's why you're the expert on this.
No,
Well,
Grace.
no, there were a couple of things in there that really struck me. Many things that struck me. One, of course, very important aspect of what you just said was that, the concept of abolition is, as sort of, people have famously noted, it's about the literal prisons themselves, right? The buildings where these incredibly brutal conditions of captivity and estrangement, as you were saying, happens.
Right.
But it's also a kind of orientation toward the world, toward our society, and toward each other.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
That can only think of an approach to societal issues through punishment, captivity, and abandonment, right?
Right.
And those are so very much sort of embedded in our social relations with each other, right?
Yes.
How we relate to each other. Sort of the way that our society is structured around making it so that only certain groups of people deserve like resources, attention, forgiveness.
Yes.
Deserve care.
Yes.
Right? Sort of the way that gender relations are constituted through race and class and capitalist relations is so central to that structure, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you mentioned the word care, because I've been thinking about this particular moment in which we're having this conversation. We're not together, obviously, because there's a global pandemic, right? But when you're talking about care and what feminism can teach us about care as an economic and political and interpersonal concept and question, it makes me think about this particular time, and as historians and social historians, we're taught to be very careful about questions of causation. However, there are correlations and convergences that I will say, as a messy historian, that to me are not coincidences. And so it's not a coincidence to me that we have the biggest system of incarceration and captivity, arguably, that the world has ever seen. And we are also, in the US, a country that has not been able to manage a global health crisis, right? That has such high rates of infection and captivity. Same is true in Brazil, which has an enormous problem, right, of police brutality. And in that context, it is women of color who are disproportionately the ones made vulnerable to death, right, during the time of COVID, from COVID-19, because they're care workers, because of being essential workers, because of being home health workers and nursing home workers, right? And so the convergences, so we need to look at the prison as an institution, and we need to look at the funding regimes, right, that place priorities on funding captivity rather than healthcare, rather than education, and how this entrenches and reproduces gendered vulnerabilities and gender violence, right? If we think of the US's relationship to prisons in a time and COVID together as a regime of racialized gender violence, right? We can kind of see where the pitfalls of our carceral priorities, or the connections between our carceral priorities and the disposability of women of color come into play. If that makes sense.
That's so important, and that's so great. And that made me think, of, so your current research is about how, the home, or, the domestic, the side of domesticity, is not a site of protection or care, or protection from state violence for Black people in general, and in particular for Black women, Black trans and non-binary folks, right?
Right.
And of course, all of the sort of protest and discussion right now about Breonna Taylor, is a case in point. But of course, there's sort of this long, long line of people who have been killed in their homes by police, you know, Ayanna Stanley Jones, or Botham Jean, or, you know, even going back to Fred Hampton, right?
Right.
You know, you know, and I think that's so important. But what you were just saying is so great, because it's both that, you know, Black folks and Black women in particular are vulnerable to police in their homes, but also that their work and their labor, their care work, and therefore their exposure to something like COVID, you know, is necessary for the maintenance and protection of other people's homes.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
So it's both at the same time.
Absolutely.
So, you know, yeah. You know, I'd love to hear you, you know, say more about why this kind of project around, you know, critiquing the idea of home and domesticity as sort of a form or as the place of safety and care through a Black feminist lens is so important for your work around carcerality.
Yeah. I mean, you said so much there so eloquently. So I'm just wanting to sort of add on to that, and I'm thinking in many different directions, because this is such a, you know, important question around the relationship between the home, Blackness and domesticity, and carceral power and carceral buildup. But, you know, we could start with a mutual friend of ours, and, you know, an amazing organizer and thinker with respect to Black feminism and the carceral state, Marilyn Ralston, right, who has talked about the fire camps, right, women's fire camps, or women's work as firefighters inside of prisons, right? So being made to put out the wildfires that in this very moment that we're talking, right, are about to escalate. And so here's an example, right, of imprisoned women being forced to work toward the protection of other people's homes, right? To put out fires that are emblazoning other people's homes. And I read an article about, you know, part of the, you know, it was a horrible article that said that we have a crisis of letting people go as a result from prison, letting people out of prison because of COVID, right? And the ravages of COVID inside U.S. prisons, that produces a problem of not having enough workers to put out these fires, right? And so it's just an example from someone who has thought so much about this and has been a worker, a fire worker when she was inside, and who I know we both really admire and respect, who, you know, has really exposed a lot of the connections, right, between labor, reproduction, the home, and violence of the carceral state. But then, as you noted, there are so many examples of women of color and Black women specifically being killed in their home that reveal that the home is not a site of protection, right? Because the notion of privacy, the notion of domesticity does not apply to Black and brown folks in this country. And so you have all of the people you've named, and you have you know, to be in the tradition of our colleague Kimberly Crenshaw, to name some folks like Eula Love and Eleanor Bumpers and Michelle Crusoe, and a laundry list of Black women, Katherine Johnston, young and old, who have been murdered by police in their home. That it's so good that Breonna Taylor is, you know, bringing this question to light for more people. And the home becomes both a site of violence, where what is happening actually is that the war on drugs, the historical war on drugs, the ongoing war on drugs, requires a kind of intrusion into Black homes, mostly under false pretenses, often without even an arrest being made, right? A just kind of invasion of Black homes for the purposes of carceral buildup. And then what that produces is a dynamic of non-protection in the home, but also additional work for Black women, additional care work that is the result of police brutality and police destruction of the home that produces the task of picking up and cleaning and caring for people who have been the victim of those kinds of violations, even if they're not killed, in emotional and material ways.
Right, right. Well, just, I mean, there was a lot there. Just really quickly going back to what you were saying about what Romarilyn was saying about the fire camps.
Yeah.
Another really major example of that that Romarilyn has also talked about is that inside the California women's prisons, they have private contractors who run basically sewing factories. And at the beginning of the crisis, there were all these women inside who, were sewing, who were tasked with sewing masks for people outside. And they themselves were not given masks to wear while they were sewing, right? So some of the women were able to make masks for themselves out of supplies that they were able to purchase, but they were not given masks for weeks, right? So that's a literal example of, incarcerated people, protecting others while being completely unprotected themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And, I think it's important to note that, what so many incredible political economists, abolitionists, scholars have taught us is that there's been this shift from a system of punishment and imprisonment that was reliant upon labor as the source of capital, convict labor, right? In previous periods, the chain gang, convict lease systems, to now the system derives capital from just captivity itself in the form of prison expansion and a complex network of private and public investments in expanding the prison. And so we can see that even in these gendered regimes of labor, it's not that that they're producing something that is massively profitable for a private company or even for the public, right? But this is what your work teaches us so profoundly. What they're made to do is be vulnerable in order to manage life and death for people who are more privileged, right, in society, or more valued, namely white and wealthy people, right? And I'm just wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about your work in women of color feminism and what they tell us, what women of color feminism and Black feminism tells us about some of these questions of life and death or vulnerability or relationality.
So that's such an important question because it is very much, even though yes there is prison labor and prison labor is just unconscionable, right?
Yes.
At the end of the day, that's not where the majority of things get made, right? Or where the majority of wealth gets produced, especially even out of the prison system, and what I really appreciated about your description of, carcerality was, you were sort of talking about estrangement, right? Or, in the sort of classical Marxist sense, the word would be something like alienation, right? But we're not just talking about the alienation of people from the value created by their labor. We're talking about the wholesale abandonment of people as not people, right? Which is the carcerality and the prison is a mechanism for the wholesale abandonment of people, and that happens in so many ways, right? It happens in terms of the literal difficulty of getting any information back and forth across prison walls, right? So that just, some basic information about what things are like in prison is just mind-boggling to so many people. I mean, I know it was to me, and it is constantly. The more I study and hear about it and work on these issues.
Right.
So there's that, and then just the fact that every single thing that we kind of assume is the case is just not the case inside of a prison, right? The rights you don't have, the way of living, right? Everything is just upside down. And then, that is just kind of consonant with, again, what you were saying about care and, who does the care work and who is not considered deserving of care, right? And, that sense of abandonment as something that is so deeply rooted in our society,
Right.
And in our whole way of understanding our relationships with each other,
Right.
So that, it's, you point to news articles or, all sorts of, social media discourse saying, so-and-so did this and that, like lock him away and throw away the key and abandon them.
Right.
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 And that's just become completely normalized. But that's also become really normalized just in our day-to-day relations,
Yeah.
and in our day-to-day relations that are sort of about punishing or abandoning or cutting out people who cannot prove themselves worthy of sort of neoliberal ideals of self-improvement and bootstraps and like taking taking care of themselves, facing the consequences of their actions, things like that, as if the consequences for different people's actions are the same.
Right.
Right? And that people, make choices based on the context and conditions of their lives, right? And what is even available for them to do.
Right.
So, these are all these different ways in which it becomes so easy to wholesale abandon people, right?
But the irony in that, the like violent, cruel irony, right, is that, as you're saying, and I'm learning so much listening to you, right, about how carcerality is premised upon a kind of that prisoners and criminalized folks, right, have abandoned social responsibility and have,
Right.
Been immoral in relationship to
And therefore
domesticity.
deserve whatever, right? And therefore deserve whatever they get, right?
And deserve whatever they get. And then what they're forced to get and forced to do is completely the work of social reproduction. It is the work of maintaining and reproducing captivity, because the vast majority of the work that all imprisoned people are made to do and forced to do, under penalty of extended sentences if they don't, is cook and clean and reproduce the system of captivity itself, right? And so the punishment for purported violations of like family morality or normative, right, ways of being in the home and otherwise, in relationship to family and otherwise, is to reproduce a cage.
Yeah. That's a really good point, because it's also that, it's so hugely, feminized subjects, women, queer folks, non-binary, trans folks outside who do the work of connecting with and caring for people inside. And then, and then picking up the pieces of the people inside, right? So whether the people who are incarcerated are, are men, women, queer folks, non-binary folks, all the folks who are inside, the people who are, writing to them, caring for their children, caring, for extended family, sending money, organizing, right? Um, there's this organization called Families United to End Life Without Parole, or LWOP, Fuel. And, it's all of these different family members of people who are incarcerated inside serving life without parole, which is really, it is a literal death sentence, right? It's death by incarceration. And, talk about wholesale abandonment, right?
Yeah.
That is the LWOP sentence.
Yes.
And, this group is basically a group of women identified people, right? Women, queer, or trans identified people, right? Almost entirely, right? So, that's also the sort of feminization of social reproduction that the prison sort of, system, or what Beth Ritchie calls prison nation, is built on.
Right. And, and that's true in terms of the collective organizing that's happening as well, right? So many of those organizations are women and queer and trans-led and comprised organizations, and bringing up Beth Ritchie, right? Her work adds another crucial, central question to this, which is, one of the things that has expanded the prison is not just the question of Black folks and brown folks and poor folks being not the right kind of gendered subject, right? Not the right kind of participant in the home. But the notion that the protection of the home can only happen through incarceration and through criminal punishment, right? So carceral feminism, that the only resolution, right, to interpersonal violence, and particularly when that interpersonal violence is framed universally, but that universal subject really is a white woman, right? That is one of the key things that has expanded what she calls the prison nation. And so, your original question about what, feminism can teach us, it's so crucial. It's indispensable. It is like a through line to every way in which the prison expands and builds itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both, as you were saying, Beth's work is very much about, the discourses and conversations about why the U.S. had to build up its prisons, as it was building up its prisons in the 70s into the 80s, which you've also written about, was so much about, discourses of, sort of gender non-normative criminality, right? Sort of, welfare queens and, people on drugs. And, these were all wrapped up around how sort of, like how they were bad parents and deadbeat dads. And, so it was so much about a sort of, supposed failure to live up to this, middle-class nuclear family norm, right?
Right.
And that so deeply underlies all of the sort of, supposed rationales for the buildup of, criminalizing, laws and policies, right? And prisons. And then, the ways in which mainstream feminism, a lot of mainstream feminism, like sort of mainstream anti-violence movements, kind of like fell into that, right? Really sort of fell into that trap.
Yeah. And, absolutely fell into that trap and absolutely expanded the prison system. And then, you have people like Kathy Cohen and Emily Thuma teaching us, right, that so much depends on actually our understanding of radical queer politics as an abolitionist project, right, as an anti-carceral project. And they have both written about both critiquing, normative, even homonormative, right, like organizing projects that don't see, as you say, the welfare queen, right, as central to a project of queer liberation. and how a lot of even mainstream radical organizations historically have not done that important organizing work and sort of reproduced a kind of queer normativity, right? And then, Emily Thuma's work showing us that actually, but then imprisoned women had this radical queer anti-carceral historic movement, right, for radical transformation. And so, there's just so much possibility if we think about these examples in this moment, as a counterpoint to what you're bringing about the dangers of a carceral anti-violence movement.
And that's just such an amazing response, and brings me to something that I definitely want to make sure that we talk about, which is that a really a really important part of why I think you and I both prioritize Black feminism and women of color feminism and organizing is because the critiques are there, the analyses are there, the histories of those movements are there, a lot of the sort of issues that are being thought through and addressed, and millions of people like coming up, and protesting around these, were things that Black women, right, and Black queer and trans folks were experiencing for a very, very long time, and had these critiques around, right, and are and still do. Right, and have become incredibly prescient at this particular moment and important.
Right.
And I think of your work as very much about that. Your first book, and the ways in which it was sort of reading, historical documents and archival texts, many of which were produced by the state, right, like the punitive carceral state, and reading across the grain to identify these moments of resistance, sabotage, critique, resilience, right? That were, sort of manifested, made possible by these, Black women and, sort of non-normatively gendered subjects, right, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, like. This isn't necessarily something that we don't have a tradition for. It's just a matter of how you read for that in the past, right? And how you look for that in the present.
Yeah, it's absolutely. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries and up through the 30s, right, imprisoned Black women were producing knowledge and cultural production, songs, blues recordings that are brilliant analyses of the carceral state and brilliant offerings of theories for a different world. And so you have that moment, and then you also have, someone like Assata Shakur, or I was recently just writing about Angela Davis's essay, Reflections on the Black Women's Role in the Community of Slaves. And so, Angela Davis gives us...
Which she wrote while she was in prison, right?
Precisely, right? Like, so she gives us a host of abolitionist thought, the books, she's writing the books on abolition. And even before she wrote, books on abolition of the carceral state per se in this moment, right? She was facing execution, right? And facing a life in a cage, and writing about, and just a host of, if you read the documents around her incarceration at that time and the brutality that she faced, and that produces in her such a brilliant analysis of slavery, right? And of the long tradition of everyday modes of refusal and everyday projects of remaking the world, which is that essay, Reflections on the Black Women's Role in the Community of Slaves. And so the tradition is so long and so rich that I totally agree. It's where we need to look for the answers in this moment, at least one critical place.
Yeah, and that, and what she's saying is like a part of that is care work, to bring it back around
Absolutely.
to,
Yeah.
what we were talking about, right? A part of that she was saying was that, Black women were sort of forced to do a lot of the care work, right,
Right.
for themselves and other enslaved people. And, that is a form of, gendered labor exploitation, right? It
Yes.
is a form of like reproductive labor exploitation, but it is also how they were able to remind themselves and others that they were human, right?
Exactly.
And therefore, deserving of better than, what they had, deserving of freedom, right? Because she says in that essay, someone truly dehumanized doesn't even want freedom,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
um,
and maintaining the very material conditions, right? Like the
yeah,
reproduction of life is the only material condition for revolution, abolition, emancipation, right? And so as much as we
mm-hmm,
don't want to
mm-hmm,
romanticize it because it is endemic of violence and extraction, labor
yeah.
extraction, right? This is the amazing dialectic she discusses and you discuss in all of your work. Actually, like it is essential for, right, a future possibility.
Yeah, and life not just defined just like it as just literal physical life,
Hmm.
but that exact understanding
Right.
of wholeness, of complexity,
Hmm.
right? As Patricia Williams says, life is complicated,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
um, that allows people to imagine themselves free,
Hmm.
in a moment where nothing about their material worlds allows them to imagine that, right? Or to think of that as a possibility, right? And so I think a part of, what abolition means for me
Hmm.
is exactly what you were saying about like creating a different imaginary,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And sort of creating something that, like, the conditions of our world as it exists right now doesn't make even possible for people to imagine might be possible, and yet you do, right?
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
you use that imaginary to pull yourself kind of into that new world
Hmm.
in a way, right? Like you invent something that doesn't exist and then you make it exist.
Yeah, that is
Right?
so
And
beautiful, Grace. Yeah, absolutely.
and that's actually bottom line what abolition means to me,
Mm.
and actually that's what I understand women of color feminism to be doing as well. That's how Audre
Hmm.
Lorde described poetry.
Mm.
That was her definition of poetry. She said there are 10, like a dozen ideas I would have thought would have been too terrifying or incomprehensible, except that I had poetry,
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's what you build a new world out of.
absolutely. I mean, I that is so beautifully said, and I think that relatedly, right, it's about the connection between abolition and you said something to the effect of like pulling oneself into, right, a different world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also a matter of practice, right? And so, Saidiya Hartman talks about
Mm.
in at the turn of the century or in the early 20th century, people living as if free, right? Like just refusing a
Yeah,
sort of
right.
life that's completely defined by encumbrance. And so it's that connection between a sort of like organizing practice and everyday practice of refusing sexual normativities
Yeah.
and the imaginary and the imagined world that produces an actual world of possibility. I really do think that is Black feminist abolition. That is abolition in essence. And Angela Davis then gives us also an institutional analysis, right? She talks about the
Mm-hmm.
failure of abolition being its accomplishment, its limited accomplishment only in the negative sense of eliminating something and not producing
Right.
the institutions for freedom, right? Like the institutions for life sustainment. And so I just, you're teaching me, right, about the range of ways in which Black feminists imagine the components of society, right? The daily practice, the institutional modes of care, right? And beauty and, living meaningful lives, being the sort of character of abolition.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm teaching you anything, but that was great. Thank you.
You always do. You
So,
always do things.
I don't know. Is there anything else like we should? I think that's a nice way to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we can end there. I think that's the crux of it, and I'm really grateful for this chance to talk with you, and the conversation.
Me too.
Yeah,
This was fun.
it was.
So, thanks, Sarah.
Okay, Grace. See you later.
Okay, bye.
Bye.